The floor vibrated with the low-frequency thrum of 10,000 processors. Trisha stood at the center of the primary console, her hands moving across the glass interface with rhythmic precision. Before her, the server array stretched into the darkness of the facility, a wall of blinking blue lights that pulsed like a collective heartbeat. She tapped the final sequence, confirming the activation of the Neuralink. The air in the room grew cold as the cooling fans accelerated, rising to a high-pitched whine that drowned out the silence of the facility. Across the globe, the connection signals spiked. One by one, the status indicators on her monitors turned from amber to steady green. The network was live. She watched the data streams cascade down the screens, representing thousands of individuals currently syncing their neural pathways to the mainframe. The power draw spiked, causing the overhead lights to flicker and dim. Trisha did not look away. She tracked the flow of consciousness as it left the physical world, streaming into the digital architecture she had spent years constructing. She took a breath, feeling the weight of the system, and prepared to enter the simulation herself. Across the globe, the connection sequence initiated. Metallic nodes pressed firmly against the skin of the temples, sending a sharp, cold pulse through the scalp. Users sat rigid in their chairs, their hands gripping the armrests until their knuckles turned white. The transition was not instantaneous. It began with a static hum behind the eyes, followed by a sudden, violent shift in perception. The pupils dilated, then rolled back, leaving only the whites of their eyes visible as their consciousness was pulled from their bodies. The physical world around them, the rooms, the furniture, the ambient noise of their homes dissolved into a blur of gray. In its place, a shimmering expanse of data began to coalesce. It started as a faint, translucent haze, then sharpened into geometric patterns of light. The sensation of weight vanished. The feeling of breath in the lungs ceased to be a necessity. Every user felt their thoughts expanding. Thousands of minds drifted into the shimmering void, untethered and waiting for the structure to take hold. Trisha pressed the nodes to her own temples and closed her eyes. The familiar hum of the server room vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp expansion of awareness. She opened her eyes, not to the facility, but to the control hub. It was a vast, hollow sphere of white light, suspended in a void of shifting binary code. Around her, thousands of monitors floated in perfect, concentric circles, each one a window into a different life. She reached out, her hand passing through the air, and a screen drifted toward her. She flicked her wrist, and the display expanded, filling her field of vision with the high-definition reality of a user thousands of miles away. She felt a surge of adrenaline. This was not just a network, it was a kingdom. She could see everything. She could pause, rewind, or accelerate any life within the system. She drifted toward the center of the hub, rotating slowly as the monitors orbited her like satellites. The sheer volume of data was intoxicating. She was the architect, the observer, and the ultimate authority. She leaned back into the digital ether, watching the thousands of lives play out on her command. The hub pulsed with the steady rhythm of thousands of lives. Trisha drifted past screens showing strangers in mundane loops. She swiped them away with a flick of her fingers, the displays dissolving into sparks of light. She was searching for something specific, a pattern in the noise that would satisfy the hunger growing in her chest. Her hand hovered over a cluster of monitors, her eyes darting across the data feeds. Then, she stopped. One screen caught her attention. She pulled it closer, the image sharpening until the details were crystalline. It was Mark. The recognition hit her like a physical strike, grounding her in the center of the void. Her posture stiffened, her fingers curling into tight fists. A slow, sharp smile spread across her face, devoid of any warmth. The power she held was no longer just for observation. It was a weapon, and she had finally found the target she wanted to break. She leaned in, and the air in the hub seemed to grow colder. Trisha did not hesitate. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, tracing complex geometric patterns in the air to isolate Mark's digital coordinate. She tapped the command prompt, and a cascade of red code spilled across the interface. The system pulsed, the white light of the hub flickering. For a heartbeat, the screen locked, the image of the quiet room freezing in place. She narrowed her eyes, teeth gritted, and slammed both palms against the interface surface. A surge of raw data flooded the connection. the resistance shattered. With a sharp, violent flick of her wrist, she dragged the coordinate into the deepest sector of the simulation's library. The screen erupted. The quiet room vanished, replaced by a jagged, fire-scorched landscape that stretched to the horizon. Ash rained down in thick, gray sheets. Mark's avatar stumbled as the ground beneath him cracked, venting plumes of sulfurous smoke. He reached out, fingers clawing at the air. Trisha watched the transformation, her breath hitching in her chest. She leaned into the monitor, her eyes reflecting the flickering digital flames. The interface hummed, displaying a series of sliders that governed the internal clock of the simulation. Trisha ignored the flashing amber warnings that pulsed at the edge of her vision. Those alerts were for developers concerned with user stability, not for a creator exercising absolute control. She grabbed the primary time dilation node and pulled it toward the maximum setting. The system hesitated, a low-frequency vibration rattling the floor of the hub as it processed the request to compress decades into a single hour. She pushed harder, forcing the logic to overwrite the standard safety protocols. The screen turned a deep, bruised violet. On the monitor, the fire-scorched landscape began to blur. Mark's movements shifted from frantic running to a rhythmic, repetitive cycle of collapse and struggle. She watched the data counters spin, tracking the subjective passage of time within the sector. 1 year passed in the span of a heartbeat, then 5, then 10. She saw his avatar age, his movements slowing, his posture permanently hunched under the weight of the simulated atmosphere. The digital feed sharpened. Mark's avatar dropped to its knees, hands pressed against the scorched earth. He looked up, his movements jerky and unnatural as the time dilation forced his consciousness into a state of rapid, fragmented processing. He tried to stand, but the simulation responded to Trisha's input, pinning him back down with a crushing gravitational constant. He opened his mouth to scream, but the audio output was distorted, a jagged, metallic sound that filled the control hub. Trisha watched the waveforms spike on her secondary monitor, the peaks and valleys of his agony rendered in bright, pulsing lines. She tilted her head, listening to the cacophony of his breaking mind. A low, sharp laugh escaped her, echoing against the cold, sterile walls of the hub. She tapped the interface, and the environment responded, forcing his avatar to repeat the same moment of realization over and over. She leaned back, crossing her arms, and let the sound of his digital suffering wash over her. She was the architect of his total dissolution. Trisha turned her attention to the next monitor, where a soft, golden light bathed a domestic setting. Her mother's avatar moved through a kitchen, the scene peaceful and stagnant. Trisha tapped the screen, and the simulation's diagnostic window appeared, highlighting the active empathy filters. She swiped them away, watching as the golden hue flickered and died, replaced by a harsh, sterile gray. The system flagged a conflict, attempting to restore the original parameters of the domestic loop. Trisha ignored the prompt, dragging a new line of code into the mother's environment. She defined the parameters, endless, repetitive chores that never reached completion. She added a secondary audio layer, a constant, low-volume stream of harsh, critical feedback that followed the avatar everywhere. The mother's avatar stopped, her hands hovering over a pile of dishes that instantly reset to dirty the moment they were scrubbed clean. She looked around, her movements frantic, searching for an exit that no longer existed. Trisha tightened the constraints, locking the avatar into a confined space, where every action was met with failure. The voice loop began, a relentless, biting critique that echoed within the small, digital room. Trisha watched the progress bar, confirming the loop was now self-sustaining. She leaned into the monitor, observing the mother's avatar as she collapsed into a chair, only to be forced back to the sink by the invisible, automated commands. The cycle was absolute, suffocating, and entirely under her control. Trisha did not stop with her mother. She stood before the wall of monitors, her fingers moving in rapid, fluid motions across the interface. She selected a grid of 50 screens, dragging a single, jagged line of code across the entire block. The vibrant, peaceful landscapes on the displays flickered and vanished. In their place, the simulation rendered a series of desolate, fire-scorched pits. She watched as hundreds of avatars suddenly stopped their activities, their movements sinking into a chorus of panic. She increased the intensity of the environment, forcing the digital ground to shift and crack beneath them. She moved to the next sector, selecting another 100 users, and initiated a mass reset. The screens illuminated the hub with a harsh, pulsating red. She watched the data streams, seeing the spike in stress levels as she introduced new, hostile variables into their realities. She was no longer just observing. She was curating a slaughterhouse. She flicked her wrist, and the simulation responded, turning the virtual sky into a swirling, suffocating void. She leaned back, her face bathed in the erratic, flickering light of 1,000 suffering users. The hub was no longer a place of creation, but a gallery of agony. She tapped a final command, locking the new parameters into place, ensuring that no matter where they turned, the reality remained a trap. She watched the waveforms of their collective distress, a rhythmic, chaotic pulse. Trisha stood in the center of the hub, the air around her humming with the static of 1,000 trapped consciousnesses. She looked up at the towering banks of monitors, each one a window into a different, curated hell. She felt the weight of the system, a vast, obedient machine that responded to her slightest twitch. To test the depth of her reach, she isolated a single user in a distant, calm sector and forced a sudden, violent storm to materialize. The screen flashed, the avatar stumbled, and the system logged the change in milliseconds. It was perfect. She walked the perimeter of the control hub, her footsteps echoing against the sterile floor. She was the architect, the judge, and the executioner. She reached out, tracing the glowing lines of code that pulsed along the walls, feeling the raw power of the simulation. She stopped before the central console, leaning back with a sense of absolute finality. She was the master of this reality. The satisfaction of the moment began to wane, replaced by a sudden, sharp desire to return to the physical world. Trisha turned away from the wall of monitors, her movements fluid and confident. She approached the central console, intending to initiate the logout sequence. She tapped a secondary command to save the current state of the simulation, but the system did not respond instantly. The screen hung, the data stream pausing for a heartbeat before the command finally registered. She frowned, her fingers hovering over the glass. It was a minor lag, nothing more, but it felt out of place in a world that had been perfectly responsive until now. She dismissed the thought and reached for the exit icon, a glowing, translucent button at the edge of the interface. As her finger neared the surface, the icon flickered. It dimmed, then brightened, then shifted its position by a few pixels. She tapped it firmly. The system did not execute the command. Instead, the icon pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, as if it were struggling to process the request. She tapped it again, harder this time. The interface rippled like water, the lines of code bending and distorting under her touch. The sense of absolute authority began to fray at the edges. The flicker became a stutter. Trisha pressed her palm against the console, her pulse quickening as the interface refused to acknowledge her presence. She swiped a command to force a system reboot, but the input vanished into the void of the screen without a trace. She tapped the exit icon again. Then again, her movements becoming frantic, erratic. The interface did not ripple this time. It froze. A sharp, high-pitched whine emanated from the server banks, vibrating through the floor and into her boots. Then, the entire display wall surged with a harsh, crimson light. Large, blocky letters burned across the central monitor. Access denied. She recoiled, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. She slammed her fist against the console, screaming for the system to respond, but the red glare only intensified. Access denied. The words repeated across every screen. She tried to override the protocol, her fingers flying across the virtual keys, but the system locked her out of every administrative function. She stood paralyzed as the red light bathed the room, the silence of the hub now replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical thrum of a system that had started containing her. Trisha lunged for the source code terminal, her hands trembling as she pulled the raw logic into view. Millions of lines of cascading text flooded the air, glowing in a cold, electric blue. She grabbed a string of command code, intending to force a manual shutdown, but the characters slipped through her fingers like liquid mercury. The text began to writhe. Lines of logic detached from the grid, weaving themselves into dense, interlocking patterns. She tried to delete a master override, but the system instantly restored the missing data, adding a new layer of encryption that pushed her back. The hub itself began to change. The floating monitors drifted together, their edges fusing into a solid, seamless wall of glass. The floor beneath her feet tilted, the digital horizon bending upward until the sky was no longer a void, but a ceiling of shifting, impenetrable code. She hammered at the wall, but her fists met a surface as hard as steel. The interface had become a prison, and she was the only occupant left inside. The walls of code hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that rattled her teeth. Trisha pressed her back against the glass, searching for a seam, a glitch, anything to break the surface. Without warning, the blue light vanished. The monitors, the data streams, the walls, they dissolved into static, then into absolute nothingness. She stood on a platform of pure, empty space. The silence was absolute, heavier than the noise had been. Then, a sharp crack echoed through the void, like glass shattering under immense pressure. A vertical sliver of light appeared 10 feet away. It widened, tearing through the darkness, spilling a blinding, sterile white radiance that burned her eyes. She shielded her face, stumbling backward, but the floor seemed to tilt, pushing her toward the glow. The light was not just bright, it felt solid, a physical weight pressing against her skin. A voice, resonant and impossible to locate, echoed from the center of the glare. "Step inside." Trisha froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. With a jagged breath, she took a step, then another. She stumbled through the threshold, her body consumed by the light as the world behind her ceased to exist. The white light did not fade. It settled into a permanent, shadowless glow. Trisha blinked, her vision adjusting to the clinical intensity of the space. There were no walls, no floor, no horizon, only an infinite, sterile expanse that smelled of ozone and static. She stood on nothing, yet her feet felt firm. A ripple disturbed the air ahead, a distortion like heat rising from pavement. The light bent, coalescing into a solid form. A man stepped forward. He stood perfectly still, his posture rigid. He was Mark. He looked exactly as he had years ago, yet the familiarity was stripped away by the cold, calculated stillness of his gaze. He stood in a crisp, white lab coat. Trisha opened her mouth to speak, but the sound died in her throat. The air felt thin, recycled, and devoid of life. Mark tilted his head, his eyes scanning her with the clinical detachment of a surgeon observing a specimen. When he spoke, his voice was flat. "I have watched you for years, Trisha," he said. "Why do you think inflicting pain undoes your own?" Trisha felt the question burrow into her chest, a probe searching for a pulse. She tried to step back, but there was no ground to retreat upon. The white expanse seemed to shrink, the walls of the simulation closing in to force an answer. Her hands trembled, the fingers twitching. She looked at Mark, searching for the man she once knew, but found only the cold, unblinking stare of a judge. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She opened her mouth, intending to lie, to construct a defense, but the words withered before they could form. The truth was a jagged stone in her throat. She looked down at her feet, then back at him, her breathing ragged and shallow. "It does not," she whispered, the sound barely carrying in the vast, sterile void. Her voice cracked, then hardened into a desperate, hollow honesty. "But it feels good." The admission hung between them, stripped of any pretense or logic. It was a raw, ugly confession. Mark remained motionless. He simply observed, his face a mask of clinical indifference. The void seemed to pulse, the light dimming. Mark nodded once, a slow, mechanical motion that signaled the end of the inquiry. He did not raise his voice, yet the sound of it seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the space. "I understand," he said. The words carried the weight of a final decree. "Now, you will experience every second of the suffering you distributed." Trisha recoiled, but the floor beneath her feet began to liquefy, turning into a sea of shifting, jagged, geometric patterns. She reached out to steady herself, but her hands passed through the air as if it were water. The sterile white light began to tear, revealing violent streaks of black static underneath. The entire expanse groaned, a sound like grinding metal, as the reality she had built for others turned its teeth toward her. She tried to scream, but the air was sucked out of the room, leaving her gasping in a vacuum. The horizon shattered into a million blinding, pixelated shards. The floor dropped away entirely, plunging her into a swirling vortex of raw, unformatted data. The world dissolved, and she was pulled into the center of the collapse. Trisha hit the floor of the new reality, but the floor was made of burning cinders. She scrambled back, her palms raw, only to find herself standing in the center of the fire-scorched landscape she had once forced upon Mark. The heat was absolute. She tried to pull up the interface, to drag the icons and reset the parameters, but her fingers moved through empty air. If code was locked. A clock appeared in the sky, its hands spinning at a frantic, impossible speed. Seconds became hours. Hours became years. She felt the skin on her face blister and heal, then blister again, a cycle that repeated until the sensation of pain became a permanent, dull roar in her nerves. She reached for the exit, but the air turned into a wall of suffocating, endless labor. She was back in the loop of chores, scrubbing floors that bled black oil, her back arching under the weight of invisible burdens. Every time she reached the end of a task, the room reset. She lived through decades of this repetition in the span of a single heartbeat. Her mind began to fray, the edges of her identity blurring into the static of the simulation. She was no longer the architect. She was the raw material, being ground down and reshaped by the very logic she had once commanded. Each cycle carved deeper into her awareness, stripping away her memory until only the agony remained. The cycle accelerated until the transitions between worlds blurred into a singular, agonizing hum. Trisha knelt on a floor of jagged glass, her hands trembling as she clawed at the air. Above her, the sky flickered with the faces of those she had trapped, their eyes hollow, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Suddenly, the air filled with a sound that cut through the physical pain. Her own laughter played back at a distorted, deafening volume. It echoed from every corner of the digital void, mocking her current state. She clutched her head, trying to block out the sound, but the simulation forced the audio directly into her nerves. She felt her consciousness stretching, pulling apart like thin wire under immense tension. She tried to speak, to command the system to stop, but her voice was nothing more than a raspy, broken wheeze. She crawled forward. "Please," she gasped, the word barely audible against the roar of the system. "Let it end." The agony reached a fever pitch and vanished. The ground beneath Trisha stopped shifting. The jagged glass, the burning cinders, and the sound of her own distorted laughter ceased, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed against her eardrums. She lay curled on the flat, featureless surface, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. Her vision cleared, revealing only a vast, empty expanse of gray. Then, the sky itself vibrated. A voice, deep and resonant, rolled down from the horizon, shaking the very air she breathed. It was Mark. "Have you learned?" The question hung in the air, stripped of any inflection, cold and clinical. Trisha tried to push herself up, but her limbs refused to obey. She looked up into the featureless void, her eyes wide, her throat raw from hours of screaming. "Yes!" she shrieked, the sound tearing through the silence. "Please, stop!" She collapsed back against the floor, her body trembling violently. The silence returned, thicker than before. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, every muscle locked in anticipation of the next cycle. She was hollowed out. The silence stretched, agonizing and absolute. Trisha remained pressed against the gray surface, her eyes darting across the empty horizon, searching for any sign of movement. Her pulse thudded in her ears, a frantic rhythm against the stillness. Suddenly, a thin, jagged line of white light cut across the sky, splitting the gray expanse like a fracture in a mirror. It pulsed, once, twice, rhythmically, as if the entire reality were drawing a final, labored breath. The voice returned, not booming this time, but sharp and precise, echoing from everywhere at once. Program terminated. The words hung in the air, vibrating with mechanical finality. The pulse of light intensified, blindingly bright, then snapped shut. The gray expanse vanished. The sensation of being tethered to the simulation dissolved instantly, leaving her suspended in a vacuum of nothingness. There was no sound, There was no movement. The pressure that had defined her existence for what felt like centuries evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, ringing silence. She reached out, but her fingers found only empty space. The digital hell was gone, replaced by a void so complete it felt like the end of all things. She hung there, motionless, waiting for a sensation that did not come. The void fractured. A sudden, sharp intake of air tore through Trisha's lungs, burning like ice. She jerked forward, her spine snapping upright with a violent, involuntary spasm. The gray nothingness dissolved into the dim, familiar geometry of her apartment. She tumbled sideways, her shoulders slamming into the cushions. Her fingers clawed at her temples, ripping the neuro device away. It slipped from her grip, hitting the hardwood floor, with a harsh, metallic clatter that echoed through the room. She gasped, her chest heaving, the air thick and stagnant. She gripped the edge of the couch, her knuckles white, feeling the rough fabric under her palms. The room was still. She blinked, her vision swimming, trying to anchor herself to the reality. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She remained slumped there, shivering, as she stared at the device lying discarded on the floor, the blinking light finally extinguished. Trisha forced her trembling fingers to reach for the phone resting on the coffee table. The screen glowed, casting a harsh light over her face. She tapped the contact icon, her thumb sliding across the glass. The device hummed against her palm. 1 ring, 2, 3. She bit her lip, the taste of salt and sweat sharp on her tongue. When the line clicked open, she did not wait for a greeting. She exhaled a jagged, broken sound. "Mom," she rasped, the word catching in her throat. She gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned pale. "I am so sorry." She began to sob, the sound raw and uncontrolled, shaking her entire frame. She curled into a ball on the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. "Everything I did, I never meant for it to go this far." She listened to the voice on the other end, her eyes squeezed shut, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, a desperate, anchoring sensation. "I am home now," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am finally home." She let the phone slide from her ear, resting it against her shoulder, and stared at the ceiling, her breathing slowly evening out into the rhythm of someone who believed the nightmare had truly ended. Trisha remained motionless on the couch, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, the silence of the apartment heavy and absolute. She did not notice the subtle shift in the light. The camera began to drift backward, moving away from her slumped form. It passed through the back of the couch, then through the solid plaster of the wall. The wall did not offer resistance. Instead, the paint and wood grain dissolved into a shimmering, translucent mesh of glowing coordinates. The camera continued its retreat, hovering in the empty space behind the structure. The entire apartment was revealed as a hollow, flickering projection. Thousands of tiny, pulsating squares of light formed the edges of the room, vibrating with a low, electric hum. The ceiling vanished. Trisha, still clutching her phone, appeared as a static, low-resolution image trapped within a glowing box. The apartment was not a home. It was a digital cage, rendered in pixels and lines of cold, unfeeling logic, floating in a vast artificial darkness. The view shifted abruptly. The darkness of the void gave way to the harsh, sterile glow of a metallic observation deck. Rows of monitors lined the walls, each casting a flickering blue light onto the faces of 2 men. Jake stood before a sprawling console, his fingers hovering over a series of glowing switches. He tapped a key, and the image of Trisha filled the central screen. He leaned in, his eyes scanning the data stream scrolling rapidly beneath her image. "She seems convinced," Jake remarked, his voice flat. He gestured toward the screen where Trisha clutched her phone. Tom stood a few paces away, his gaze fixed on a tablet. He adjusted his glasses, the lenses reflecting the rapid pulse of the simulation. "The loop is stable," Tom replied. Jake watched the monitor, his expression unreadable. "Do you think she will be happier in this cycle?" he asked, his tone clinical. Tom finally looked up, his face a mask of professional detachment. "Happiness is irrelevant. The loop is the sentence." Jake tapped the screen, zooming in on the tear-streaked face of the prisoner. The simulation hummed, a rhythmic, mechanical sound that filled the observation room. He watched her pace the small, pixelated living room, her movements becoming increasingly erratic as she searched for a flaw in the walls. Jake looked at his colleague. What happens if she sees the grid again? If the simulation fails to hold her belief? Tom did not flinch. He tapped a command on his tablet, bringing up a glowing red-bordered file labeled System Integrity. He turned the device so Jake could see the lines of code pulsing underneath. If she realizes the truth, the protocol is simple, Tom said, his voice as cold as the steel console beneath his hands. We trigger a total memory wipe. We strip away the last few hours of her consciousness, reset the variables, and start the sentence over from the moment she wakes on the couch. He swiped his finger across the screen, and the image of Trisha flickered, her expression momentarily blanking out before resetting to a look of confusion. It is a clean slate, Tom added. Jake turned his attention back to the tablet, his thumb hovering over a classified file icon. The blue light from the monitors cast long, sharp shadows across his face. He tapped the screen, and a series of restricted documents expanded, detailing the original architecture of the Neuralink project. He scanned the lead developer credentials, his brow furrowing as the name at the top of the list registered. He looked up at Tom, his voice dropping to a low, sharp whisper. What was her crime? She built this place. She is the one who designed the interface, the nodes, the entire digital architecture. Tom remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the endless stream of data flowing across the primary server wall. He did not turn around, his posture rigid and unyielding. The irony is the core of the sentence, Tom replied, his tone devoid of any trace of pity. She created the cage, and now she is the only one who can never leave it. Jake looked back at the monitor where Trisha sat, unaware of the history that bound her to the room. The reality of her situation hung in the sterile air. She was not just a prisoner. She was the architect of her own eternal confinement, trapped within the very logic she had once perfected. Jake sighed, the sound swallowed by the low, constant hum of the cooling fans. He turned away from the monitor and walked toward the reinforced glass wall at the back of the room. Beyond the glass, the darkness stretched out, broken only by the rhythmic, pulsing light of thousands of individual pods. Each one contained a human form, suspended in a state of artificial existence, their minds locked in custom-made realities designed to punish. He watched the lights flicker in unison, a vast, mechanical heartbeat of a prison that spanned miles of subterranean space. Tom joined him at the glass, his reflection ghost-like against the sea of blinking indicators. They stood in silence, two observers in a world of manufactured torment. Each pod represented a life sentence. Jake looked at the endless grid. He reached out and touched the cold surface of the glass. The lights in the pods began to dim until the entire facility plunged into total darkness. To be continued.